This is our second video on looking at what are called full phase aspects. And let's just talk about some of the basic aspects. You know, these are what I call the Sweet 16. As astrologers, we're familiar with a variety of different kinds of wheels, including the wheel of houses, the wheel of signs, the wheel of aspects, and so on. There are also in the literature a number of attempts to link these wheels together and show how they might correspond one to the other. So we often hear that the zodiac sign Aries and the first house correspond to one another, even though they have no strict astronomical relationship with each other. So what can this mean? What links these two, and other wheels for that matter, to one another are that they share the cycle of phases that any cycle or circle has. So for instance, the first house and the zodiac sign Aries correspond to one another because they each represent a particular phase in a whole cycle of 360 degrees. And all cycle phases follow a similar pattern. So with that in mind, let's take a brief look at the phases in a cycle, because I think that will help a whole lot. Now, all circles or all cycles can be analyzed and broken down into any number of parts that we require. For instance, if we divide a circle into two parts, then we have an inner point and an outer point. Use the cycle of the breath. It's maybe the most common. We can say that when we inhale all the way, expand our chest outward, we're at the outer point. And when we completely exhale, collapse inward, we are at that inner point. And these can be divided into 4 parts or 4 hemispheres. Then we have an inner point, the breath all in, an outer point, the breath all out, and 2 additional points, the point where we're halfway between the inner and the outer, we're going out, and the point where we are halfway between the outer and the inner, coming back in. So let's just work with those 4 points for a moment, although we could jump right into dividing the circle by 12 and come up with 12 houses or 12 signs. We'll get to that in a moment. Using the signs of the zodiac and dividing by 4, we would have to say that the zodiac sign Cancer represents the outermost point, the point of greatest experience. In fact, in the tarot deck, among the major arcana, the sign Cancer corresponds to the card the Chariot, the vehicle. So the zodiac sign Cancer is the vehicle or chariot in which we ride. This makes the zodiac sign Capricorn, which is the point of greatest inwardness, having to do with the ability to manipulate and use the practical mind. So inner and outer, we have experience, which is Cancer, and we have vision or analysis, which is Capricorn. By that same token, then, the zodiac sign Aries becomes the point midway between Capricorn and Cancer, the point in the cycle or circle or wheel where we pass from the inwardness or mentalness of Capricorn to the outwardness and feeling of Cancer. And by the same logic, then the zodiac sign Libra is the point in the zodiac where we pass from outwardness, Cancer, feeling, back in toward inwardness, which is Capricorn. If we want to look at the wheel of houses, in the same way, then the first house would correspond to Aries, the 7th house to Libra, the 4th house to Cancer, and the 10th house to Capricorn. Now, over the years, I've spoken with many well-known astrologers about how these different cycles or circles correspond, and they all seem to agree. In a conversation that I had with Dane Ruhdyar many years ago, However, he did point out that we can pick any point in the phases of a cycle and apply the circle of signs or houses to that. There's not only one way to do it, in other words. And of course, that's true. However, by and large, astrologers tend to make the sign Cancer be the point of greatest experience, outward, feeling, experiencing, and Capricorn the point of greatest inwardness, the non-physical point, the analytical point, the very practical, visionary point, and so on. But all cycles can be broken down into phases. And examples of cycles include anything that returns and repeats itself in a regular rhythm. And this would include, the cycle of our heartbeat, the cycle of our breathing, the breath, the cycle of day and night, the solar-lunar cycle, the yearly cycle of the Earth orbiting the sun and the zodiac, and so on. All cycles follow the same pattern. That's the key to this. And because astrology is all about the study of cycles, it's super important that we understand how cycles can be divided into phases and what each phase can mean. If we can better understand cycle phases, then that understanding will automatically benefit us as we look at any astrological cycle, signs, houses, aspects, etc. So it's well worth our while to study this. Now let's look at the cycle of aspects. This is the synodic cycle we've been talking about. Going from new moon to full moon back to new moon. That's the synodic cycle of the sun, earth, and moon. But here, let's just look at abstractly the 16 phases that represent standard major aspects used by astrologers all over the world. Before we look at individual aspects in the aspect cycle, let's first understand something about the 4 hemispheres. Any cycle can be divided into 4. And just quickly put there, the innermost hemisphere, the outermost hemisphere, the waxing, forming hemisphere, and the waning, deconstructing hemisphere. Now, the inner hemisphere is just that. It's inner, private, non-physical, mental. Use whatever words you want to describe that out of which everything physical and visible arises. This inner hemisphere consists of 2 quadrants, the first and the fourth quadrant, traditionally. In that inner hemisphere of those 2 quadrants, the left or the first quadrant is all that is in the process on the waxing side of the inner, of coming into being or forming, our plans which we want to make real. And on the other side of that inner hemisphere, the fourth quarter, like the fourth quarter moon, that contains all that's in the process on the waning side of drawing conclusions, ending whatever experience that we had in the outer fulfillment hemisphere. And the outer hemisphere demonstrates everything that is physical, that has come into existence, and it comes to its peak at the opposition, the 180-degree point. Now this is the visible universe and the full experience as we see, as we know it. After that opposition point, the experience begins to fade from existence and to gradually come apart, just as we do when we age. Everything falling back out of existence and trying to draw some conclusion, some lessons from what we learned from having the experience. So the waxing hemisphere tells a story of how things come into existence. Starting with ideas that come from nowhere, from unmanifested. They turn into plans. The plans turn into action. The action becomes something physical, and the physical builds to a peak or a point of greatest manifestation. That's the goal of waxing. That's what we call the opposition as far as aspects. Now the other half, the waning hemisphere, tells the reverse story, how something that's fully manifest as an experience, how it begins to be known or understood and recognized, that we had an experience, we went through something, what is it that we're going through? And then it gradually begins to pass away. eventually decaying or falling completely out of manifestation, leaving us with only whatever lessons or experience that remains kind of as the seeds for the next cycle. That's the waning cycle. And then there is always a next cycle, because that is the very essence of what cycles are, that they repeat themselves endlessly if given an opportunity. And the Buddhists call it samsara. So let's go through the standard aspects, what I call the Sweet 16s, and let me talk to you a bit about how they might be interpreted. Now you can use your own interpretations. I'm going to just give you pretty standard stuff so that you know that we're on the same page, but don't be too critical of my interpretations. Just go ahead and use your own. I'm just trying to help out here. So that 0 degrees point is the conjunction point, where the two bodies are conjunct in the same point. And just we're going to use the lunar cycle because we all know it. This would be the equivalent of the new moon. And this is the innermost point in the cycle. It's where everything starts or comes from, as it emerges from the subconscious or wherever our thoughts come from and begins to arise into the conscious mind. And they're often described as more like impulses, sometimes called in the literature a tone, perhaps more pre-verbal than verbal, something stirring deep within us. These are seminal moments where seeds or kernels, essences of new experience within us first stir and begin to sprout. So these times can be very potent. Even when they occur, we don't know what they're eventually going to mean for us. So seminal is a good word. Now another way to look at this aspect is that it's a turning point or a phase shift from coming in to the end of coming in and the beginning of going out. And such a dramatic shift involves a complete change of direction, kind of a reversal of polarities. Now the next standard aspect is the semi-sextile aspect of 30 degrees. That means there's an angular separation of 30 degrees between the slow-moving planet, the sun in this case, and the moon. With the semi-sextile, whatever tone or impulse first stirred within us at the conjunction, here rises to consciousness enough for us to begin to grasp and formulate it. Often due to its inner potency, we could call it, these ideas soon take on the form of some kind of plan for action. Something needs to be done or could be done. Something could be made manifest or real. As we are formulating, these plans tend to be at first very broad in scope, and we can look around us on all sides for help. Someone or something to help make these ideas real. In this way, in this sense anyway, at this point in the cycle, we're very community-oriented. Welcoming any assistance we can find. We're trying to make sense of this. We haven't even gotten to making sense of it. So it can be very much of the traditional Aquarian effort. In fact, the zodiac sign Aquarius and the 11th house correspond to this phase of the synodic cycle. Another way to look at this aspect is that it's a recovery period after the conjunction. At the conjunction there was a complete phase or polarity reversal. So in the semi-sextile, we're adjusting to this change. We're trying to get our bearings, and we're coming up with a new approach, with new plans. The semi-square, 45 degrees of angular separation between the sun and the moon. Now this is 45 degrees. It's the midway point between the seed impulse or starting point at the conjunction and the 90-degree point, which we call the waxing square of the first real manifestation. So this is just, geometrically a midway or turning point turning away from the pure idea, or what we could call the seed impulse, and toward making whatever has been grasped, these new ideas that we've had, we tried to plan it out. But this is where we actually come up with a concrete plan to actualize it. Now, this is, in my personal experience, these 45-degree points on the circle, which in the Tibetan astrology have often been called the tomb, T-O-M-B signs, the tomb signs, are for most of us more difficult or challenging than the traditional square aspect, the 90-degree points, if only because they're not so obvious, not so clear. The reason may be that each 45-degree point in the aspect cycle, and there are 4 of them, presages the more major square point soon to follow it. Maybe this deserves some explanation. I'll give it a shot. The 45-degree aspect is the first point in the new cycle where what we could call a midway point is reached. In this case, we're moving away from the seed impulse and we're moving toward the manifestation point, which would be marked at 90 degrees, the traditional square aspect. Just as the 90-degree point is midway between the inner starting point, the conjunction, and the outer hemisphere, which reaches opposition at 180 degrees. So the 45-degree point is midway between the seed impulse, the starting point, and the point of first manifestation at the waxing square at 90 degrees, which corresponds to Aries and the first house. In this sense, the 45-degree point is a harbinger or forerunner of a yet-to-come more powerful experience, but it's our first real contact with this type of separation. That's the challenge of it. And in that sense, the 45-degree point may be more actually significant to us, at least psychologically, than the square, because it introduces us to this new type of event, being torn in 2 directions. After the 45-degree point, when we reach the more dramatic 90-degree point, we have, in a way, already been inoculated. We've been forewarned of this type of experience. So, in other words, it's already in our memory from the point of the 45-degree aspect onward. Be that as it may, the semi-square point often brings some obstacle to confront us. If only that, for us, it marks a true change in direction, the first one. And we'll find it to be, in this particular 45, there are 4 of them, but this one, the waxing first 45, the advice traditionally that I give clients is it's more comfortable pushing ahead. Keep going in whatever direction we currently have been. That change in direction requires that we adjust our own path somewhat and adjust our direction to accommodate it. And each of the 45-degree aspects in the cycle, the other 2 being the 135-degree aspects, requires a slightly different shift in attitude on our part. And here, this first 45-degree angle, the shift is turning away from new ideas and trying to gather more of them, and beginning to go with those ideas that we've managed to already grasp. That's the challenge. That's the 45-degree. To me, 45-degree aspects are always challenges. Next standard aspect is the waxing sextile, 60 degrees. 60 degrees between the sun and the moon. And the sextile is one of the 4 main energy-giving points in the cycle. It's where we have enough added space or room to actually accomplish something, or at least to get some work done, and see some progress made. Ideas and plans that were formulated earlier on in the cycle here are being advanced, organized, move closer to the stage of reality, which begins at the 90-degree or square phase. While this waxing sextile is a moment of energy, it's also the point where a certain amount of discipline and even sacrifice is required. I find the fact that it corresponds with the zodiac sign Pisces and to the 12th house makes a lot of sense in this context, because both of these factors, the 12th house and Pisces, refer to the need for sublimation, for some kind of sacrifice, if only to set the stage and to help bring through the plan or concept that we've been carrying with us into reality since the conjunction, the new moon. It's kind of not unlike a mother preparing to give birth. Anyway, the point here is that during this aspect, the 60-degree aspect, from there on up to the 90-degree aspect, there's very little room for distraction. And any and all kinds of extraneous matters or small obstacles that that might appear really should be ignored or somehow efficiently dealt with, whatever it takes. In other words, pay the dues of the past and move on. This is not the time for argument, not the time for quibbling. We should just suck it up at this point so that we can bring as much of our concept through to reality as possible and not have our energy just kind of siphoned off and frittered away by all the material of the past that may arise and demand our attention and thereby block our way. So that 60-degree aspect is a key aspect. Now we come to the waxing square, 90-degree aspect, 90 degrees from the sun to the moon, waxing, going out. This is one of the four main turning, or what I call changing points in the aspect cycle. It's the moment when we cross over from the inside, from the inner world of ideas and planning, to the outside, where whatever we've been developing up to now actually is born. It makes a visible start. So we can look, somehow this is the first physical appearance in the outer sphere. And this aspect corresponds to the zodiac sign Aries and to the first house cusp, both of which signify, similar types of events. It's the rising sign, something coming into view. Something new rises into view, it appears. Now, that's something that we manage to get across at the square into appearance. May not be much, but somehow it's made it over the great divide, all the way from an idea that just barely stirred in the mind to now some kind of reality. This square aspect marks the appearance, in fact, and the physical start in the outside world of something we can point to as other than just a thought or idea. It's real. And from this point, from this first start or sprout, it will grow whatever is the nature of the particular combination of planets or bodies. But anyway, what appears here at the square is undeniable. It's the rising sign. It's the first house. It's Aries. Now, the next of the standard aspects is the trine. And in this case, a waxing trine, 120 degrees from the sun to the moon, moving outward. The moon is still moving away toward full moon or opposition. This is a lot of space between a square and the trine. It's a full 30 degrees from the waxing square to the waxing trine. And all of this ground that's covered should mark some kind of physical growth. As whatever is at issue, whatever plans are coming to be, they're, in this aspect, increasingly taking on form and materiality. That is, we're making them real. The trine aspect is another of the four energy points in the entire cycle, the two sextiles and the two trines, where there's a burst of what we could call emptiness, or better way to say, a burst of room, enough space or expanded atmosphere to really get something done. It's like an energy pocket. This is the primary point in the cycle for the active and rapid building of form. And this aspect corresponds to the zodiac sign Taurus and to the second house, which, as we know, they're all about form and materials. The increased flow of energy with the sextile makes this, traditionally speaking, what used to be called an easy or good aspect. And the astrological literature is filled with testimony to the fact that the trine aspect is to be welcomed whenever it appears. It represents ease and fluidness of motion and a sense of expanded time with room enough for great things to be accomplished. At the same time, let's not make too much of a good thing out of the trine. Sure, it represents freedom or room to accomplish things, but, and especially in whole chart patterns like the grand trine, it equally can bring too much room or emptiness, which can amount to loneliness, to being an outsider, to standing outside, experiencing too much distance. So, as with so many things, the middle way of balance is a sweet spot. This brings us to the sesquiquadrate, 135 degrees, basically another semi-square. And again, it's waxing, so it's 135 degrees from the sun to the waxing moon, heading for opposition. And the waxing sesquiquadrate is the second 45-degree aspect. It's one of 4 aspects that in the Tibetan tradition, as I mentioned earlier, are called the tomb signs. These, and not the squares, are perhaps the real turning points in the aspect wheel. You know, the places where the rubber meets the road. Each 45-degree aspect presages or comes before a major turning point. And by that fact, perhaps, at least in my experience, may be more important as beacons of forthcoming events than the more major aspect that's still to come. In this case, the sesquiquadrate comes before the opposition or 180-degree point. In this waxing 135-degree aspect, the building part of the waxing cycle at this point is essentially complete. Much like we reach our physical peak as young adults, but continue to mature until our Saturn return. Almost like a ripening, like a fruit ripens. The waxing sesquiquadrate marks the point where, and this is the key to this particular semi-square, the waxing sesquiquadrate marks the point where further pushing forward or driving ourselves to create or build can actually be detrimental. And if it has any difficult qualities, it would be that if we fail to heed this warning, which is to ease off, you know, not good things happen. And this, anyway, my point is that it's here that we should pull back on the throttle, you know, stop driving forward and rather continue working with whatever we have achieved up to this point. If we do that, then we avoid what can be a more, you know, friction-filled experience of this semi-square type aspect. So what's required here is a change in our attitude. You know, adjust the direction of our sails, like sailing a ship, and avoid problems. That's the challenge here. All of the 45 aspects are challenges. Now we come to the last standard aspect before the opposition, and it's called the Inconjunct, or quincunx. It's the waxing Inconjunct 150-degree aspect. You know, as mentioned, it's the last major aspect before the opposition. Whatever was conceived at the conjunction, way back at the new moon, and, you know, worked into some kind of plan at the semi-sextile, and launched into physical reality at the square, and physically built into something bigger at the trine, is complete here. It's much like the physical body of the young adult. You know, that body's complete before the Saturn return at 30. But it continues to be filled in and ripen. At the Inconjunct, there should be no more pushing forward and no more building. This is not the time to start anything new, but instead it's the time to wrap it up, to finish up whatever is already in the works. What we have set in motion to this point. So that it's here that everything is connected up and the fine details are followed out to the nth degree. All the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted. And this phase corresponds to the zodiac sign Gemini in the 3rd house. So communications and connecting things up are key. Anything that has to do with completion and details. Now we're at the opposition. 180 degrees. This is the equivalent of the full moon. This is the top of the cycle, physically speaking. It corresponds to the sign Cancer. It's the most expanded or physically manifest point. The result, so to speak, in an outward sense of the entire cycle, whichever two bodies may be involved. This is it. Here is the fruition itself. There's no pushing forward from here, and as yet no decline either, but only the full-blown experience. Something to feel, something to be in. It's not a point in general of recognition or awareness. The awareness of what all this is happening, this feeling, things we're feeling, what it might mean. That comes later. But rather, this is the experiencing itself of what it means, so that we have something to look at later. So that later there's something for us to be aware of. As the experience starts to die away and wane after the opposition, and we begin to understand what it is that we just went through. So this is the going through it itself. Now, traditionally, this is the point just to abandon yourself to the experience and drink it in, to feel it fully. This, like in zodiac correspondence, is the sign Cancer, the 4th house, the home, or the body itself. In the major arcana of the tarot cards, this is the Chariot, or vehicle. Now we're past the peak. We're past the opposition. We're no longer waxing or growing. We're beginning to wane. And we reach the Inconjunct 210 degrees. We're starting to return toward the next new moon. At this point in the cycle, we're past the opposition. The experience peak that we just went through is over. And as we move away from the opposition and begin to get some distance from it, for the first time in this cycle, we are able perhaps to put that experience into some kind of perspective, to at least begin to get a handle on it. Where before we were lost in the experience itself, feeling it, knowing it. Now we have the first dawning of what it might mean, what that experience that we went through might be all about. And at first, perhaps this is just a vague awareness that we've been through something that up to now we were just lost within. We didn't have any awareness. That's the nature of experience. We have to actually get into it and go through it. You can't watch it and do it at the same time. First you do it, then you watch or realize what you've been through. This phase is the dawn. This is just the beginning of watching it, just the beginning of realization. If we look for the corresponding zodiac sign, that sign is Leo. And for houses, it's the 5th house. So this dawning awareness of having had an experience and now somehow owning it fits right into the traditional qualities of pride, ownership, expression, and so on of Leo. We've gotten through the experience. We've survived and come out of it. We're starting to come out of the other side, and we're beginning to get our arms around it. We own it. It's our experience, and we can begin to describe and talk about it. So this phase is often connected to telling or teaching others about whatever we've been through. Now we come to another one of the 45-degree angles, one of the 4 challenges. In this case, it's a waning sesquiquadrate, 225 degrees. As mentioned, it's another of the 45-degree points where we can always look for a shift in perspective or direction. In this case, the shift is away from the experience we had at the opposition. It marks the end of the freshness of the inconjunct, during which the first awareness of the meaning of the opposition might have dawned. That awareness is more or less over. It's, or it's fading. And maybe it's getting old fast. Talking about, describing the experience, telling or teaching it to others already is starting to lose its luster and begins to sound hollow, maybe even phony. The shift is from a more innocent and fresh feeling to one requiring a change in our attitude. It's here that we have the first signs, to use an analogy, that the party's over, and we had better cast about for what's coming next, and how will we cope with that. Perhaps the most important point here is that we are now firmly in the waning hemisphere, and while in the waxing hemisphere, push and forward motion was the order of the day, here it's just the reverse. We don't push. We must now learn to let things come to us. We don't work to make or present things, but rather we learn to listen and we learn to receive. It's all about handling and accommodating whatever is. The 225-degree semi-square aspect marks the letting go of the thrill of first discovery that arose just after the opposition, and the beginning to cope with the fact that this discovery has ended, or is at least wearing thin. It's time for us to take a more reflexive and a more cooperative stance, a more cooperative attitude, like listening, like adapting. That's the challenge here. Now we come to the waning trine, 240 degrees. The waning trine aspect brings, it's another energy-filled time, one of increased space or elbow room in which things are possible, things can happen. Where in the waxing trine, we got things done. Here in the waning trine, we help things to happen. Again, it's the difference between judo and aikido in the martial arts. Judo is offensive and attack-oriented. Aikido is passive. It's oriented more toward accommodating whatever force is already in motion, and by that accommodation directing it. With the 240-degree trine aspect comes the clear realization that the pride and innocence that we had in the discovery time after the opposition is fully fading. The experience itself is over, it's done. And at this point there's ever more clear proof, or it's easy to see. So it's the time to clean up after the party and to try to make the most of the experience we can. This is an aspect of actively conserving or preserving whatever we can of what we have just been through. So it's one of drawing conclusions, learning how to draw conclusions, or as I like to say, learning how to fail successfully. And this is the aspect of conservation, bar none, and we find ourselves scrambling to cap off the wells, to save the energy, plug the leaks, where before there was what seemed an endless overflowing of experience. Here it's clear that the experience itself is fading and will soon become even weaker yet. The action on our parts here must be passive, in that we actively save or gather what we can. So it's all about returns, and it's about catching what we can, like cupped hands filled with water, and as I mentioned, plugging the leaks. Now this brings us to the waning square. The waning square is 270 degrees. Represents another major turning point, a point where we move from the external, the outside world, the manifest hemisphere, into the inner, non-physical or metaphysical hemisphere. It marks the very end of the physical experience that we had at the opposition, and the end of any personal connections we might have had to it up to this point. That more personal experience is not only over, but we have we've drawn whatever conclusions we can from it, and we hopefully have saved those up or taken note of them, because the party's over. And in a single step, we move from a more personal point of view, kind of sober up, to a much less personal and more objective or even impersonal perspective. We agree to leave behind what has already been left behind, or as Gertrude Stein said so beautifully, before friendship faded, end quote. You get the idea. Just as the waxing square marked a point of the entrance of something real and substantial into our world, so the waning square marks the beginning of a more spiritual, a more metaphysical, beyond the physical experience. We kind of grow up fast in a single step here. We cut the cord. This phase corresponds to the zodiac sign Libra and the 7th house. And these have been traditionally connected to the outer or public, the impersonal, and also to marriage. This phase is related to marriage because it's at this point that the physical experience drops away and can be fully seen and accepted, and that's the key word here, for whatever it was, for whatever it now is. We can see it. We can accept it for what it is, and we can say, I do. And we're able to move on, to drop off our personal connections and to begin to see what's going, that all of that's going nowhere further. We are, as they say in marriage, for better or for worse, now beyond that time. Now we reach the waning sextile, 300 degrees. The waning sextile, like the waxing sextile, involves an abundance of energy. An abundance of energy in the sense of increased room or space. Perhaps atmosphere is a good word. An atmosphere in which activity can take place. There's room to move around in, room to work. Yet unlike the waxing sextile, where things are headed and oriented toward forming and building, here it's just the reverse. What has been in a state of deconstruction since the opposition, here is reaching a more advanced or critical stage. The waning square saw the end of personal attachment to experience, to whatever the opposition brought. But here we take another step back, even farther, to where we can actively work to take things apart that no longer work for us or have any relevance. The waxing sextile is the maximum point where the critical faculties are brought to bear in examining the nature of whatever has resulted from the opposition experience. Examining it in the sense of sorting the wheat from the chaff, sorting out what has lasting value from what already has lost its meaning or is rapidly losing meaning. That which has no meaning is here removed or culled out, and it's no wonder that the zodiac sign Scorpio and the 8th house correspond here. For here all of that which is superfluous is stripped off, leaving the naked truth or results. Whatever has lasting value is all that remains. Reaching the last semi-square, the waning semi-square, 315 degrees. Now the waning 350-degree phase brings further criticism. Here even to criticism itself, finding that enough is enough, and even the use of the mind to criticize and remove obstacles begins to shut down, and itself be removed or deconstructed. So things are folding inward. The train is leaving the station. It's time for the conductor to jump on board if he's going. And as I've said before, this is another of those 45-degree turning points, or as the Tibetans call them, tomb signs. They have to be negotiated. And there's always some kind of possible friction or attitude adjustment required on our parts here. And as pointed out, here we have the leaving off of even criticism and the turning ever more inward, partaking of one's own counsel, finding rest and stability not in more but in less, in a simpler life. In reality, less is more. That's the challenge. Now the last of the standard aspects, the waning semi-sextile, 330-degree aspect. It marks the last of the 360-degree cycle, the last stop before the new renewal at the conjunction, at the new moon. And this phase has been called the seed stage, or the seed essence, and it corresponds to the zodiac sign Sagittarius, and also to the 9th house of long journeys. Long journeys here refers to things that last, whatever lasts long, whatever lasts longest, and therefore everything that religion is concerned with. You know, the word religion meaning to bind back and hold what is most lasting, what is most long-lasting. You know, like eternal or lasting truth. The frankness and truth of the zodiac sign Sagittarius in the 9th house fits right in here. So this phase marks the end result of the cycle, the result of the entire experience, here reduced to the seed essence, or to the what we could call the bare bones, the seed from which the next cycle or circle will spring. So there you have a quick overview of a synodic cycle as looked at in the 16 most commonly used aspects. You can apply this to any cycle or circle you want. Wheel of houses, wheel of signs, synodic cycle. Learn a lot. It really helps in interpreting. Now, in the next section, I'm going to go into the interpretation in a lot more detail. So, thanks for listening.